I think the AHA guidelines need to be rethought in the context of all studies in total, including Pure.
This kind of evidence is just observational, and I think it paints the picture in the background, but it doesn't actually drive to specific recommendations that we can make. We've known for a long time what a healthy diet pattern looks like. It does contain lots of fruits and vegetables. It can contain whole grain carbohydrates and minimize the types of simple sugars and starches. It can contain lean protein. It can contain lean dairy. It can contain nuts and seeds and things like that. But we know that diets that tend to trend towards lots of processed food that contains more sodium, more fat content, and more sugar don't do well. But we're not going to go too far wrong if we're generally focusing on saturated fat and not having too much in our overall diet.
Even before Pure, there's been a lot of controversy on the guidelines related to fat. It is not for me to answer that question as to what went wrong with the guidelines. Guidelines are written with information at a current moment in time, okay? And as new information comes, some guidelines, especially the clinical guidelines, are very open to changing. But the nutrition policy guidelines have been resistant to changing.
Types of evidence that really would require a major shift, I think, in recommendations around eating patterns. Our best data come from studies where people are given the food to eat, and the most recent example of that is the PREDIMED study, where they got very careful recommendations about what their diet should contain, with the addition of either nuts and seeds or olive oil. And even in a high olive oil place like Spain that was already eating a Mediterranean diet, the imposition of a further Mediterranean style eating pattern on top of what was already in the background compared with placebo had real benefits in terms of cardiovascular disease outcomes. So those kinds of trials where we can actually control the eating environment are the best levels of evidence to make changes in guidelines.
All the guidelines are largely based on observational data. Now, would I like to see large randomized trials done? Absolutely. Now remember, the largest dietary randomized trial was the Women's Health Initiative that the NIH ran, a very august body with the best nutrition scientists in the world, or at least in America. I mean, America is not the world, but at least in America involved. And after 7 years and 50,000 people, it showed neutrality. So here are randomized trials supporting at least some of our findings. You all know the PREDIMED randomized trial that was done recently. That was not a low-fat diet, that actually did not say anything about lowering saturated fats. In fact, they increased non-saturated fats.
I think that across many decades now in dietary recommendations, there have been many people guilty of cherry-picking data to support the points that they're interested in making. What's important is to do systematic evidence reviews, carefully synthesize all of the data that are available, because then you can make sure you're getting the highest quality studies and that you're not taking junk science as of equal value as the well-done studies.
The recent AHA guidelines heavily depended on studies that were done 30, 40 years ago at a time when diets were very different from what they are today. They also had difficulties accepting some of the modern day studies like the Women's Health study, which did not go along with their guidelines. My hope, and I know the AHA is a very well-meaning organization, is to convene a group of experts who are not part of the people of the traditional thinking and review the totality of the evidence, just like the Cochrane collaboration has done for trials as well as for epidemiology, plus different groups, and come up with guidelines that are culturally sensitive and culturally specific.
I think we're all guilty of picking things that support the positions that we already have. But when you approach your guidelines with that kind of careful evidence review, it's much harder to be able to do that. I think when you take the next or the latest paper that looks at dietary intake in an observational setting. It's very important not to overreact to something like that, nor to underreact. I think putting the evidence in context is very important. What should the cardiologist do for the next patient that they see after reading a study like this? I think we have to return to first principles. It's much more about eating patterns and whole foods than it is trying to micromanage the percentage of fat or the percentage of carbohydrate in the diet. And returning to the important findings of one of these papers, that fruit and vegetable and legume consumption should be central to every eating pattern that we're recommending for our patients. We'll never go wrong by doing that. The rest is really working around the margins, because if we get our patients eating more fruits and vegetables, they will eat less of whatever's bad, whether it's sodium, carbohydrate, or fatty proteins. So, you know, I think for the cardiologist in practice, keeping the recommendations focused on whole food eating patterns will help them, you know, avoid the ups and downs as the latest and greatest study comes out.